a few seconds to let everyone filter in from their last session. I hope you were able to catch Tech Canceling Cancer. That was a really incredible trio of entrepreneurs and speakers. I'm really excited about everything that they're working on. We are focused in this session on 100% renewable, a how-to guide for the grid. I'm here with Richard Romanowski, the CEO of eleXsys, who's joining us from Brisbane, Joern Tinnemeyer, CTO of EnerSys, who's in Boston, and Robert McClure, investigative journalist and lead researcher of Future in Review's forthcoming white paper on this subject. My name is Berit Anderson. I'm the COO of SNS and Fire. So our conversation today will be about 45 minutes, after which we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you have questions for our speakers during the conversation, please drop them in the chat, and our MC will call on you directly once we've wrapped up our interview. So as an introduction to this conversation, I want to bring you all up to speed on a relatively new project of Future in Review. Just after our last Fire conference, I was in Brisbane keynoting a conference on misinformation, global politics, and climate change, just before a large portion of Australia caught on fire. And I had the chance while I was there to visit with Richard, who had just been at Fire as a fire starter. And Richard gave me a tour of eleXsys' facilities, and we got into an intense conversation about the grid. Why our current electrical grid in the US is not a two-way grid, how eleXsys' technology could fundamentally change that without requiring any major upgrades of grid infrastructure, and what the US would have to do to even entertain the possibility of a two-way grid. And that conversation spawned a new partnership between Future in Review and eleXsys, and now EnerSys, which joined onto that project. And over the last year, we have convened a series of roundtable conversations that brought together experts from all parts of the renewable energy space to help outline two things. Number one, what are the current barriers to creating a grid powered by 100% renewables? And number two, what new innovations and technologies could help overcome those barriers? So we've been working on that report, which is basically a how-to guide for transforming the US grid, which we hope will be very helpful to politicians, policymakers, technologists, investors in the US, but also abroad, because I think it is a broadly applicable analysis of grid infrastructure and necessary grid upgrades to make any grid 100% renewable. So this is something that we at Fire hope will be a model for our ability to solve hard problems as a group. This is an incredible community of technologists and innovators, and we see this project as the first in a long line of future projects that deal with significant challenges such as this one. So I hope you think, as you listen to our conversation today, think about that. And if you have ideas about what our next set of challenges should be, we welcome them. We would love to start conversations if you have areas in your industry that you think would be ripe for a Fire focus. And we are also just starting to think now about how do we take this outline of steps for how to transition the grid to 100% renewables and actually make it reality. So as you hear this conversation, think through how can we take this report and the work that we've done over the last year and actually turn that into new policies, new technologies that are deployed across the US to help make that transition. So Robert, I'm going to start with you. You've been kind of our lead researcher on this report. You've put in an incredible amount of time and energy in the last 5 months, focused on understanding the grid and what parts of it are working, what parts are not. Can you help those of us who have not put in perhaps that level of time and energy to understand, 500-foot level, what's going on there? What are the basic components and geographical distinctions that make the US grid such a beast to tackle?
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Berit, and thanks for bringing me on this project. Been in journalism a long time. Never thought I'd learn this much about electrical engineering. So anyway, it's been fun. Yeah. So right. So I think this in the early part of the conversation, my task is to sort of show, well, what's this grid that we want to make 100% renewable? So I'm just going to take you back to last year. Okay. Think about it. We had the Dixie Fire in Northern California. A single tree fell on a single transmission line. 1 million acres burned, 48,000 power customers had rolling power blackouts. That's about the size of South Carolina. Then we had the Texas storms. Okay, more than 200 people died. Some people were burning furniture and books and newspapers to stay warm. Then we had Hurricane Ida, and a whole bunch of transmission lines went down. Nearly 1 million people had no power. Sometimes this is in August in Louisiana. So thousands of, weeks later, you had these people still sweltering and powerless in basically third world conditions. And there was a report analyzing how there was an unprecedented number of hackers targeting the grid during that year. So cyber espionage is on the rise. So that's just sort of like what just happened to us. But the problems with the grid are manifold. The grid is a patchwork that started in the early 20th century, when significantly utilities were granted monopoly power. And we'll probably get back to that later in the conversation. But it's grown up, and we have a real patchwork across the country now. There are some efforts to try and connect it all, but the reason there's just the whole grid is not up to the task that we have now. And I can tell you some more about what we would need to do to get to 100% renewable. But just as evidence of that, from 2000 to 2005, we had in this country 44 major outages per year on average. In 2020, we had 385 major power outages. So the grid is growing increasingly, just as it is. And this is with utilities making significant investments, not what needs to be done. Of course, the weather is one of the reasons that those major outages are going up. But that is a fact of life with climate change, is we're going to have many more of these weather events that can really, but it's sometimes even like a squirrel. A squirrel gets into the right place, and boom, a neighborhood or even more goes out. So
can you describe the basics of, in the US, we have essentially like 3 separate grids, right? Yep. Which are all connected via longer term transmission lines.
Yeah, well, they're actually not connected. That's the problem. There's basically 3 grids. One's in the east, one's in the west, and one is Texas. And we go into why Texas has its own grid, but it's basically because Texas didn't want to be regulated by the feds way back in 1936 when the Federal Power Act passed. But yes, so there's a major problem is in going to 100% renewable grid is you cannot take solar power that's being generated in or wind. That's a better example. Wind power along the northeastern shore of the United States, and use it to help people make their breakfast in Montana, because down the middle of the spine, basically of the middle of the country, there's these 2 grids are cleaved off. There are these tiny little interconnections that need to be replaced anyway. But there's no plan to actually unite those 2 grids. And then Texas is its own case. But if you could get all 3 of those grids together, we would make a big difference.
Well, and that's just the beginning, because the other part of it that you and I have talked about a lot is every utility is different, right? So the utilities within each grid, each of those 3 different grids are each they're all regulated in many different ways. There are many different structures, there are many different incentives kind of behind that. But at the base of many of our utility infrastructure is a kind of a problematic incentive structure. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
You're talking about the private utilities?
Yeah, why is it that utilities are not incentivized to improve?
Well, they are doing some improvements. What they're doing is doing what the way that they're generally regulated. You're talking about private utilities here, is that they can make money by building up the grid in order to, and in this case, in some cases, to handle, well, either to make it better because it's so bad already, but or to make it more receptive to renewable power. But that's a really expensive way, as I think we're going to get into. It needs to be done. There needs to be investments in the grid, but it's quite expensive. But the utilities like it because they're guaranteed, maybe 10% on their investments, which is a pretty good pretty good rate of return right now, but that money could wait and be used much more efficiently to make the grid 100% renewable. But those utilities don't really have an incentive to do that now. They're almost completely unincentivized to do that financially. And one thing is that they've been traditionally regulated on the basis of cost and reliability. So sort of the traditional consumer attributes, but that is actually the third leg of that stool needs to be renewability and fighting climate change, but that is not there. Hawaii is just starting to experiment with a system that has a lot of promise to get the utilities there, but they still have a ways to go. Is there anything else you wanted for me to cover in this introduction, Berit?
No, I think that's good. So one of the key components of this white paper or the how-to guide that we're creating is the need for a two-way grid, which we do not have in the United States. Richard, you have some of that in Australia, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about eleXsys' technology and how it empowers that possibility.
Thank you very much, Berit. I guess I'll just jump to Ireland. Cook University in Ireland basically forecast globally that if we filled one half, so 50% of all the rooftops in the world were filled with solar, we could generate all the energy we need. We could generate all the energy we need from rooftop solar. Obviously, we need batteries to make that work 24/7, but just gives you an idea of how much sun and how much rooftop solar energy is available. Yes, that's not possible without solar farms and wind farms, but the problem is when you send that energy from your house or business backwards into the grid doesn't accept it, right? So this is, at the moment you go, so people are saying, okay, we're doing rooftop solar now, but when you get to around 15 or 20% rooftop solar, the grid starts to choke. It starts to have a conniption where it can't handle that backwards energy, right? And it was never designed for it. It was designed as a one-way grid. So a small amount of 15 or 20% energy backwards it can handle, but once you get past that, it can't handle it. And Australia and Hawaii are examples of that happening now. It's real in Australia. So I install my rooftop solar system in Australia. I think I'm going to get a 7-year payback because I'm sending energy backwards into the grid in the daytime. But I'm actually, what's happening, the solar inverter curtails because of voltage issues, and then my 7-year payback or 5 or 6 year payback becomes 12 or 15-year payback, right? So that's what's happening today in Australia in real time. It's real. This is not a joke. This is what's happening here in Australia because we have so much rooftop solar, right? So it's a one-way grid, and then what we do, eleXsys turns that one-way grid into a two-way grid, so that that household still gets their 7 or 5 or 6 or 7 year payback. So that's what we do, and we do it in a very cost-effective manner. Nothing's simple when you talk about the grid. It's a very complex machine. It's the largest man-made machine in the world, right? So you need to get your head around the fact that this is, and that's who your fire guys are. You fire guys know this is complex. So we use, yep. So your turn, Berit.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask if you could provide a little bit more detail for the audience about how specifically you do that.
So in electricity, power electricity, you have something called reactive power. So we use reactive power to be able to keep, so when I'm sending energy backwards into the grid, it raises the voltage and therefore it shuts down the solar inverter. We put our eleXsys unit beside the solar inverter, using reactive power, it's a very efficient device, and therefore it allows for that solar inverter to always stay at optimum energy output, and so it doesn't curtail or shut down. And that means your 7-year household payback is a 7-year payback. And, or commercially the same thing if you're doing commercial solar. So the key is we're using reactive power. So one way, if any of you are energy gurus, we've taken the STATCOM or synchronous condenser out at the solar farm. So at the solar farm, wind farm, power station, you have an old analog technology, which is called the STATCOM. We've digitized that and made it very small and put it into the distribution grid. So that's like in the power station, it's a $50 or $100 million piece of kit that we've now made down to sort of like a $5,000 piece of kit, but put it in the distribution grid. So is that I'll stop there. Is that
That's great. That's great. So I know you guys are working on a very exciting project in Brisbane and beyond. I think now it's grown to a full Australian project with IKEA. Could you explain how that's working and what you've learned from that project about how to facilitate microgrids?
So eleXsys, this is thank you. That's a really good case study. So when you go, so what's the benefit? So the benefit is with eleXsys, we can move the power station from out in the country into the city. The IKEA project is an example. It is a 10 times bigger microgrid than anyone else in the world could do. 10 times bigger. So and we started this conversation with IKEA, we would do sort of 500 kilowatts of solar on the roof. Now, with our technology, we're able to put in over 5 megawatts of energy generation and storage into that site. So it becomes a mini power station, right? So it becomes a mini clean energy power station in the city, and 750 of those can replace one coal power station. So first thing, it's 10 times bigger. B, 750 of those can replace a coal power station. And the third and absolutely most important thing, Berit, this is really the critical thing, is we make it an institutional grade investment. Forget I use the French word technology, right? Sorry, I'm just being careful not to be. I'm being recorded, right? So the important thing is not the technology, not that it's 10 times bigger. It's that the pension funds could now own. So this IKEA project is not owned by IKEA; it is owned by a pension fund, and this is the start of them investing $1 trillion to decarbonize the world. So when you actually create an institutional grade investment, which is that over the next 20 years, that investment will not be curtailed, will not lose money. Therefore, it's something they will invest into. So I'll stop. People ask me questions, but it's a real crucial point. It's not about the tech, it's about the finance.
I think it's about both, right? I mean, your tech unlocks the ability to do that, but that because it's a two-way grid and it's enabling a faster return on investment, it also unlocks the financing for the opportunity.
Berit, thank you. Yes, but the key is exactly if the pension funds would not invest if there was an unknown income stream. So the current one-way grid gives you an unknown income stream, and therefore they'll never invest, right? So you need to give them security and assurance, and that's what eleXsys does.
Fantastic. And so with the IKEA project specifically, it's also that energy that's being then exported to surrounding neighborhoods, right? It's essentially acting as a mini power station within within that neighborhood. And that's something that I think, you know, the idea is you could replicate that in other big box stores around the world to similar effect.
100%. So Jan, who's the CEO of IKEA Australia, he loves it. He goes, we are giving clean energy to the local community, right? So the numbers are huge. It's 570, so it's almost 3 megawatts of energy, you know, per hour per day, you know, being sent into the grid. It's the numbers are phenomenal, and he is so proud of it. And yes, that's what you're doing, but you go, if you replicate that many times, you can actually replace a coal power station. So Berit, that's, you know, this whole concept of what we're doing, and it could be owned by pension funds around the world. So it's, and they're just dying to invest. And the other thing is, it makes batteries in Australia, it makes batteries economically viable without a grant. So when we moved to California, where there's a huge grant process, it's just a no-brainer to do things in California, for example. I'm just sort of jumping.
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned batteries. Let's turn the mic over to Joern over here, who is the czar of batteries, as it were, the expert, resident battery expert. Joern, I know, so you've been working with EnerSys for several years now, and a lot of your early work was focused on transitioning EnerSys from a lead acid battery company to a lithium ion battery company. How are you thinking about the future of energy storage now in the US as it relates to the grid?
So you almost basically have to start back again in terms of that explanation of the grid. And I think Donald Sadoway from MIT put it the best way. It's the world's largest supply chain with zero inventory. And so there's hardly any latency that's around the system. I mean, the power that you're using in your home, for instance, was generated instantaneously. It didn't come from sort of reservoir, unless you're in some certain places where geographically you can have some hydro storage that's associated with it. So in order to create that latency, you have to create a storage effect. And then this also solves in part to what Richard was talking about, the curtailment problem is, if I have excess energy, where do I place it such that I can use it at some other point? Or if I look at electricity much more fluidly in terms of pricing, which is the best price? Is it what I can receive instantaneously out of the grid? Is it what I can receive right now out of my storage system? And it starts to bring in that particular type of variable. And then when you start to think about storage, there's different types of storage that obviously you can start to place onto the grid. It need not necessarily be batteries, right? There's already storage on the grid. Hydro storage using in essence potential energy is one way. Inertial energy is another way. I mean, that's a lot of the synchronous generators that we have at power stations are in essence storing that significant level of energy inertially, and then that can later on be given off, but you can also do that in terms of flywheel technologies, for instance, as well. And then if you think about batteries, it need not be just lithium batteries, but it could be other things. There are flow systems, flow cells, and so forth that one could use as well. So there's numerous different pieces of storage that one can add, but the storage problem is critical if you want to start to advance the grid, particularly if you think about the grid in terms of renewable energy. About only 10 to 15% can be done, say, with geothermal or hydro and so forth. The rest of it will be variable renewable energy, solar, wind. And then this, again, will have, in essence, an inverter effect that starts to lose that inertial component. So you start to have to think about, how do I create that frequency regulation or that inertia that same spinning AC synchronous motor has? And that, again, storage can provide you with that power capability.
So I know you all have thought a lot about the term, the electrification of everything, which in case you're not an energy nerd like the three of us or four of us, is basically the idea that in order to make everything powered by renewables, there's this huge transition that needs to be made across manufacturing and transportation, you know, to EVs and electric trains and planes and buses and manufacturing facilities. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you're thinking about the future of energy storage as it relates to the electrification of everything? Because there's a huge draw on and an increase in needs that comes from that transition as well.
I think the biggest thing that, if we take one example, start with that, some sort of hyperscale concept, for instance, is e-mobility, right? Electrification of transportation systems. And if we start to think about electrifying every vehicle within the country, so for instance, how much you would have to add approximately 25% more generation capability in the United States in order if every driver were to have an electric vehicle. And then that's sort of a back of the envelope type of argument, because again, you have to think about how the grid is designed. Have you designed it to the point of just peak power components, or do you design it towards this constant base load and bringing that base load component up? You can kind of imagine that even if I say that most of those vehicles, say just roughly 80 to 70% of those vehicles would be charged at home, you'd have about 7 to 10 kilowatts of charging that it would take place. And then say everybody comes home between the hours of 6 and 7 in the evening and everyone plugs in their vehicle, the grid would never support it. In Norway, they did a study and 30% of the transformers would actually fail due to overloads, even though that this is happening. The other way that you can start to think about it is if you had DC fast charging, for instance, and fast charging vehicles would be the other way to charge those vehicles. If you had about 150 kilowatt charger, each home typically uses about 7 kilowatts, you're putting instantaneously 20 to 23 homes onto the grid and then taking them off again. And again, these type of transients, the grid was never designed for. And here we at least think storage starts to solve some of those problems. So for instance, if I put in a buffer storage in between that high energy discharge capability, I can not only then support that, I don't need to update my transformer, but then I can also have that buffer capability work in what's called distributed energy resources and aggregate those energy resources exactly as Robert was, or as Richard was saying, and start to look at virtual power plants and how those can then later on also help the grid, especially once we start to put on variable renewable energy sources onto it. So batteries start to play a very critical role, and then we can start to think about grid interactive efficient buildings and then say how those battery systems can then even help a typical office building, for instance, reducing its energy charges. And again, it goes down to optimizing the cost level of that energy that building uses. If it uses from the grid, renewables, or from the storage system or components thereof, proportionating those out.
So we've talked earlier this morning in our opening session about the issues that the US is facing at the moment with lithium sourcing. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious how you think about using lithium ion battery storage, energy storage versus other kinds of energy storage in the overall distribution across the grid.
I think
are there places that seem better attuned to different kinds of storage?
I think the most prevalent type that everyone is looking at right now is lithium ion storage. If you think about that, by about 2025, so 3 years from now, we'll have about 1.2 terawatt hours per year of lithium ion production in the world. There's massive level of funding that's going into this. There's about 600 gigawatt hours that's been announced for Europe by 2025. Asia obviously is the front runner in this, and herein lies the problem, right? If you start to think about electrifying the grid, if you start to think about electrifying the transportation system, you start to, if we were to do this today, you would have to be reliant upon Asian sources. Even if you build some of that fabrication here within the United States, the precursor materials, 80% of that cathode material still would come out of Asian resources. So that upstream capability would need to be solved. Obviously, the manufacturing capability would need to be solved, and that is an immediate problem that we need to look at. And it's not easy to solve. If you think about mining, for instance, you can't just place a mine anywhere. It depends geographically where that mine and where those resources are, and you have to make sure that you can start to mine those resources as quickly as possible if we are to ever catch up on this. The other thing is of course, to start to look at different types of technologies, even in the lithium space, moving towards solid state and higher energy densities and so forth, meaning less materials, but for more energy storage capability, maybe certain methods that one could use, but they're still 4 or 5 years out before those are readily and commercially available.
I think it was Bob Gallion in our roundtable who said that even if you wanted to build a lithium ion battery factory now, just getting the steel that would be necessary to build the factory, you're looking at about an 8-month wait, I think is what he said.
I would say it's about 14 to 16 months right now.
Okay, so we're talking about a year and a half essentially before you can even source the steel to start building a factory. And that's another, it's one of those things that I points to the urgency with which it is important when you compare that with some of the timelines that we were talking about in our earlier session with Peter Wadhams and Dalia Lithbaum from NASA, the timelines of climate change and how long, how quickly that sea level rise is going to accelerate. It's like, okay, this is very urgent, right? It's not a wait and see. We can't wait around for Congress to try to pass an energy infrastructure bill. I think one of the things that we've learned from this whole experience and this whole project is this is going to have to happen without political support from a federal level necessarily, right? Like there's a lot, great, we would love the federal support but there are all kinds of market incentives and technological innovations that can happen without that to help push things forward rather than waiting around for Congress to be able to pass a bill.
I 100% agree with you. It's we need to just do this and stop asking for the politics. The politicians are just so slow, and they're trying their best. You find, like they're doing their best, but it's not easy. And we need to just bloody do this, and we can. So the latest we're waiting for is the FERC FERC 2222, which will allow us to do the IKEA project like in Australia in anywhere in the USA. So that means that from the technical term is from behind the meter, I can compete and work in the energy stock market. So the USA has an energy stock market. So FERC 2222 lets me compete into the energy stock market like a gas power station does, and I can do that in a commercial site. So that's what we're just waiting for a few months for that to actually happen, and that changes that's the only thing we need to radically change the rules, right? So you've got a system in the US where it's very monopolized. And then when you allow us, the private sector, to compete, we'll be able to compete and do it much, much better, faster, cheaper than those utility monopolies. Is that so? Sorry, Joern, is that you happy with me to make sense? Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, no,
So
I couldn't agree more with your statement, and I would think the thing I would add to it. And Berit brought
wait, Joern, could you back up and just explain for people who aren't familiar with FERC what FERC is, what it does, and why 2222 is so important?
It's the federal government. Maybe Joern can explain it more. They create regulations that force the states to apply different rules. So you have a very monopolistic system, and they then create a rule. And this rule lets at the moment only the gas and coal power stations can participate in the
energy market,
stock market. Right now, they're saying that me as a private sector person, I can participate in the energy stock market in my IKEA type site. So that I'm just trying. Do you want to add anything else, Joern? Is that making sense? Cool.
I think from the top level, that's exactly it. It allows these DERs or distributed energy resources to participate directly on the open market, just like any other resource would.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
And I think for those who are curious to learn more about that, I see Will and Robert just dropped a link to that decision in the chat. So feel free to check that out. And
the other word for it, Berit, is it actually democratizes energy.
Right.
So this huge, scary word that the monopolies are very scared of, which is the democratization of energy. So that's one way of saying it. So over to you. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I think so. I want to make sure that we touch on some of the benefits of microgrids and also some of the risks. And Joern, I know you have been in touch with some federal level folks about some of their concerns around cybersecurity and infrastructure. Could you tell us a little bit more about what their concerns are?
Sure. I mean, for a lot of these systems to work, and especially two-way grid, and it requires communication and a lot of data communication. There's a lot of cloud resources that need to be incorporated in order for this to function the way that you need it to function. And the problem with that, it provides then entry points into and risks for hackers to start to go into that system. So it provides a cybersecurity concern. You can then start to think about, from a very, people see, and you can YouTube this, obviously, with electric vehicles, or any vehicles have been hacked, and people trying to take control, especially as more and more electronics and controls go into those vehicles. Same thing can start to happen if you think about even an energy storage system that sits in your home, right? What if someone hacks into that and then provides different set points that potentially could create a dangerous situation? So obviously, there's once you start to create a much more heterogeneous grid, that heterogeneous component by itself may insulate you from particular hackers. It's not uniform. It's not that everyone is using the exact same system. However, these smaller areas may still be potentially attacked. And so there's a lot of concerns, obviously, from the federal government, that if we start to think about these type of distributed systems that are then much more controlled by communication protocols, what could potentially happen there, right from the home user to even what happens at much larger sites, if we think, multiple megawatt hour installations.
Right, particularly, I mean, with what we're seeing, especially, just last week in Ukraine and this week in Ukraine, when your country is so clearly under close cyber scrutiny and attack, I think it's a extremely valid concern, and it's something that so far the U.S. seems to have managed to maintain a certain level of security on its grid, across its grid system. How are you thinking about? Well, actually, I'm gonna switch gears. So we've got just a few minutes left until we have to start our Q&A, and I want to make sure that we get to talk a little bit more with Robert about some of the recommendations that we're outlining in this executive summary. So we'll be releasing our executive summary to the whole FIRE attendee audience this week. Robert, I would love to hear from you about what key recommendations that includes.
Okay, good. And in order for people to understand why these recommendations are different from what we're doing right now, I just need to say something that hasn't been said, which is the big plan right now to make the grid renewable is to build a bunch of very large, basically solar and wind farms a long way from where people live and run a whole bunch of transmission lines there. And that's going to need to be done, but there's no way that can be done over the next 8 years, in which time we're supposed to reduce our emissions from the grid by 50%. Just briefly, where Build Back Better was half of it passed, $65 billion worth of grid improvements passed. The part that didn't pass was another $70 billion, just to stay up with what we need to keep the grid from falling apart. The American Society of Electrical Engineers said that we needed to spend $208 billion by 2030. So I know that's a lot of numbers, but you basically, even if Build Back Better had passed, that wasn't enough. There were 22 shovel-ready projects ready to go, that would handle 10% of that task. So that's where we are. That's just to really to get started on this. So I will say that that's all sounds, and I've been like Mr. Gloom and Doom, right? We have a terrible grid and nothing that we've proposed yet is going to work. But so I feel kind of like a real downer, but I have to say that I'm really, after looking into this project, I'm really buoyed and I'm really hopeful about the future. And here's why. We don't have to do it that way. We can do some of it that way with the big solar and wind farms and the transmission lines, but it takes 10 years on average to put in a transmission line. There are all kinds of better ways to do this. So the main thing is, I mean, I guess the central to our recommendations is we need a truly two-way grid. And what that means is that that there's not this curtailment, so that if you have your whole rooftop covered with solar panels and you're producing a whole bunch of solar energy, that you should be fairly compensated for that. First of all, we need the technological basis for not having to turn that power back from the grid. And that's what eleXsys is doing. And that's really, really helpful. But then you also need to fully compensate and fairly compensate the people, because you want to build in you want to build in actually a profit motive for people to go out and put in as much as possible. So a two-way grid, there's the technological and then there's the regulatory hurdles, and eleXsys is helping us to get over a lot of that, the technological, and I think FERC 2222 is a big step on the regulatory. So that's the big thing. So broadly, what we need to do is more of what I call DIY, do-it-yourself energy. Joern referred to it earlier as DERs, distributed energy resources is the official term. We're talking about rooftop solar, which Richard referred to that recent paper that showed just globally how significant that could be, which I don't think anyone had toted up yet. We haven't really realized until now just how much potential there is there, because there's roofs all over the place. Community solar is sort of a variation of a microgrid. It can be with microgrids, but in microgrids, I put something in the chat. It's a real basic explanation, but the basic idea is that in the places where we live, not way out in the hills, we can gather a lot of energy, and then with batteries we can, and the right technological improvements, which we know how to do, you can share that in your own community, and it can be put onto. So that can be integrated into the grid all the time. But if you have a situation like a Texas or a Hurricane Ida, that neighborhood has its own microgrid with battery storage.
Robert, I apologize for interrupting. Just
please go ahead.
Let's go even bigger. Let's talk about the bloody Ukraine and Europe situation.
Go for it.
If we had Germany and Europe with microgrids, and they didn't need that gas pipeline, the whole Ukraine situation would be radically different, right? So at the moment, Putin has Europe as hostage because of that gas pipeline. But microgrids, if we did commercial, and the key is commercial. Residential is just a blip. You really got to do commercial microgrids. If you did that, that would change the whole energy. So energy is such a big part of our politics. And I know you guys, the whole, the people watching this are very big on this. The politics, integration of technology and politics is so crucial. And if we fix energy so that we're not reliant on in this case, Mr. Putin, it changes everything. I can then react very differently well, I won't say anything. So I can react very differently to Mr. Putin. How's that? Cool.
That's a great point, Richard. I think that the political implications and the geopolitical implications and the international implications of a distributed grid that combines, I don't think any of this paper is advocating not going forward with solar farms and wind farms. Those are an important part of the energy infrastructure. The main point is that we need to go broader than that, right? It needs to be bigger than that. And that kind of distributed energy infrastructure is what's going to create resilience to cyber attacks. It's going to create resilience to these large scale kind of like natural disasters that Dalia described earlier. It's going to create resilience to international political pressure. which is currently kind of bending the will of a lot of Europe and the US, right, even. So it's it's a very key point. I think it's time for us to switch to Q&A, and I know there are a lot of questions for this group, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Robert, before I turn things back over to Evan, is there any other kind of key recommendation that you missed from your report that you want to slide in there?
Just briefly, you know, we already have a whole bunch of transmission lines out there. So rather than build a lot of new ones, we will need to do that, as you said. But there are people working right now, and we're going to be pointing to one or two of them, who are figuring out how you can build those differently to carry additional power. So rather than having to go out and get a right of way and spend 10 years, there's a whole bunch of these, and that would pay for themselves right now. There's also demand response. There's also, we'll be talking about how to rejigger utility regulation. I'll let it go at that. You can look at but there is a way to do this. I'm very hopeful.
There are a broad range of technical and policy solutions that can be applied to accelerate this process greatly, and we plan to do as much as we can to support that effort. So I'll turn it over to Evan, and let's take some audience questions.
So the first question is actually from Will. Will, do you want to talk about hydrogen storage? You want to ask your question?
Yeah, exactly. I would love to talk about some other stuff as well, but this is a question for Joern. Just in your experience, where are we at with long duration hydrogen storage, and where is that going to be possibly commercialized in the future?
So, I mean, personally, I'm a battery guy, not a hydrogen guy, so I can't speak from high level of expertise when it comes to the hydrogen economy. I can say that before coming to EnerSys, I did a lot of work for the automotives. Clearly, the automotives have been toying with fuel cell technology, of obviously where hydrogen is a big part. And that is considered the next level strategy for batteries. So batteries is considered more of a bridge, if you will, between gasoline and then hydrogen. Now, that was the thinking 5 to 6 years ago. That can change if we start to think about solid state systems. So there are new technologies that are coming in that could give that range capability. But when you start to think about transport trucks, you know, the very large rigs, more than likely that'll start to switch over towards a hydrogen style concept. And you'll start to see hydrogen economies developing. For instance, Iceland, with its massive level of geothermal, would be a wonderful place to start creating hydrogen.
Absolutely.
All right, Chuck, you had the next question talking about environmental effects. Are you with us? There he is. Hold on, I've asked you to unmute, so that might help if a button pops up.
There we are. Okay, thanks. I was wondering about anybody looking at the environmental cost of both producing and disposing of the different kinds of storage devices that we're talking about, batteries, solar, or if you use water power, the life of solar panels is typically 25 years or so. How do we get rid of all that stuff? How do we make it? And how much does it cost environmentally to make it in the first place?
Can I give them a quick answer, Joern? Right?
Sure, go ahead.
It's way bloody better than doing a gas power station or an oil, or, you know, a coal power station, guys. Like, yes, there's a footprint, and yes, at the end of 25 years, the panels have to be recycled, but they are recyclable, right? So the key is they're recyclable. The key is they're using the sun's energy. The key is with batteries, yes, there's a footprint, and it's not as perfect or pretty as we would like it to be, but bloody hell, it's much better than a coal power station. So Chuck, I'm sorry, I need to be blunt with you. You know, we need to do this. Okay. So
can I add on to that? Because Chuck, to your question, I think there have been some really interesting innovations recently in lithium recycling specifically, and solar panel recycling. And that, I think, is a really bright spot in that specific field, because what used to be completely untenable is now, I think we're seeing that actually lithium is not a necessarily renewable resource, and we do have a finite supply and a huge demand for it. And therefore, finally, we're getting to the place where the economic incentives are enough to motivate companies to do that kind of recycling, which then makes things a lot easier over time as we move forward.
So
That's,
I can maybe add
that's
bit
a much nicer answer, Berit. Thank you.
I can maybe add a bit more to that. I mean, lead acid batteries and lead, and people hear that and they think about toxic components and attributes of lead, and clearly there are such. But here in North America, it's probably the most recycled product there is at 99.2 to 0.3%. So it's highly recycled, it's highly circular. So the starter battery that you have in your car, that lead was likely mined back in 1980. Lithium will start the same way. It's kind of this predicted tsunami. You heard me say how much lithium production is coming in place and how much the electrification is happening. Northvolt just recently announced a battery that was made out of 95% recycled material using 100% renewable energy. And this is really just the precipice of where this type of technology is to come. And quite frankly, we don't have enough nickel and cobalt and lithium, obviously, to have this massive level of electric or battery buildup. So we have to have the circular economy coming back into it. It's a must. The technology is there. And Richard's right. The alternative is worse, far worse.
What is the efficiency of battery storage now?
So the efficiency of the battery itself, the lithium battery is extremely efficient, close to 100% efficiency. The problem is the conversion, the electrochemical conversion that you have around it. Lead acid is a little bit worse. Any battery, just if a battery is warm and it's charging, clearly it's a loss of efficiency that you have. It's a very quick test that you could do. If you keep the state of charge in the right boundary conditions, you can have almost 100% efficiency moving back and forth, close to it. But the power conversion, obviously, that's where the inefficiencies start to come in. But a typical setup, you can get close to 90 to 93% efficiencies.
Chuck, I want to make sure we give.
Chuck, I just muted you because I want to make sure we get to a couple more questions. But as a quick reminder, I know a lot of us always have follow-on questions, and we don't want to monopolize all the Q&A time. But you can reach out to people based on their profile in here and ask a couple more. So that's exactly what I would do, and perhaps it'll come up in one of our cocktail hours or something. Ty Carlson had a question, and Ty, you were asking about why we would do such long transmission, and second about microgrids and kind of how they would play into the mix, I think. So Ty, are you here? All right, I'm just going to ask Ty's question. I think the first part got partly answered and the second part didn't. So he was saying, isn't 50% of energy lost in transmission? I think you guys talked about that. Long-term or long distance transmission not making sense. He asked about offshore, like offshore wind, I believe. And wouldn't that make a big difference for a number of major population centers? Also, microgrids make a lot of sense. However, the power companies are now pushing back really hard on compensating the homeowners. So maybe we could just cover that briefly because I feel like that's of interest to folks. Is offshore a good solution? And are there are ways to improve that pushback that people are getting in homeownership?
So let me maybe get a stab at that one. If we look at Europe, if we look at Germany, there's a lot of offshore wind that was installed in the North Sea area, in the Baltic Sea. And to this day, there isn't the high voltage DC link that was supposed to bring the power that was generated from there down into southern Germany, still has at this point, is still stuck in a political quagmire. And so this is part of the problem, right? It's not only I don't want this in my backyard is the first problem, but even if we put it into offshore, is how easy is it to transport that energy? We will have to lay those high voltage tension lines. The other aspect, of course, is distributed energy probably is the better way to go. I mean, as Richard already said, there's significant level of roof space. If you think about e-commerce right now and all the distribution centers, and think about all that lovely flat roof space that exists there, how much energy that could provide at a much more heterogeneous level, specifically where you need it.
Joern, just say it differently. Same but different is, I don't need to build new DC transmission lines. I already have billions and billions of dollars of distribution grid. All we're doing is using the distribution grid investment much better, right? So just say, I'm just saying the same thing differently, right? So we have this the biggest man-made machine in the world is the transmission and the electricity grid, right? So all we're doing is using the local suburbs and all that billions upon billions of dollars much more effective by installing more and more rooftop solar and batteries. So that's a simple way of saying it. Is that you happy with that? Cool.
Yeah. So we are about out of time. We're gonna have to wrap up quickly, but Amory, we managed to get you unmuted, and I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in because
Well, thank you. Yeah, on transmission, this may be what Robert McClure was referring to. I'm not independent on this technology because I advise the firm, but this is an example of a new kind of transmission conductor. Instead of a steel core, it has a much lighter, stronger carbon fiber core protected chemically and physically by an annealed aluminum tube. And you pack more aluminum in the same weight on the same towers. So you can take about 2.5, 3 times more power over the same but fatter conductor. And that means, as Robert said, that instead of taking a decade with a lot of risk and cost to get a new right-of-way, you could just reconductor with this stuff, string new wires on the towers you have, and that could cut a decade off debottlenecking the grid for more renewable expansion. And then for the next trick, they're going to put a fiber optic element in here, read out with the same mass-produced equipment used for downhole fracking readout. And that would give you real-time indication all along the line within a meter or two of the sag, strain, and temperature, which would let you do true dynamic loading up to that conductor's capacity at that moment. And then you can carry even more power. Instead of looking up a worst case table, you actually know what's going on. So I think this kind of conductor revolution already proven and by utilities and about to be made in the US has some quite important implications for speeding the renewable revolution. Thanks.
Thanks, Amory. All right, we are out of time. This is a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure we could do it forever, but I'm going to let Evan finish that up. The last thing I will say is that if you are interested in this technology, there's a company, fire starter company, that will be talking about their version of this tomorrow called Power Light Technologies, and they are using fiber optic cable to transmit energy.
All right. Well, that concludes our time. So thank you, everyone. I know you're all busy, and that was a fantastic panel. Like Berit said, I think we could talk about it a lot, but there is a white paper coming out, which I'm very excited to see.